In a world where shadows whisper louder than the living, one night changes everything. A girl vanishes without a trace. No screams, no struggle, only a chilling silence lingering in the air. And those who go looking for her, they return different. Because this isn't just a disappearance. It's the doorway to something ancient. Something watching, choosing, waiting for the next soul to slip through the cracks of reality. As our characters dive deeper, strange messages appear where no human hand could reach. Objects move when no one is near. And the air itself grows heavy, as if the darkness is learning their names. This story will take you into the heart of fear, where truth twists, trust shatters, and every choice could be the last. So stay with me, turn off the lights, and prepare yourself for a journey you won't forget. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to The Spoken Pen for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, which part of the world are you listening from? The knock on my door came just after midnight, soft but strangely deliberate, like whoever stood on the other side was using the last of their strength. I opened it expecting a neighbor, or maybe some drunk stranger who had wandered into the wrong apartment again. But instead my twin sister Claire collapsed into my arms, barely conscious, battered, shaking, and looking nothing like the bright, kind soul I had known all my life. Her left eye was swollen completely shut, deep purple and painful to even look at. Her lip was split, dried blood crusting down her chin, and the worst part, the part that made my stomach drop, was the dark bruising wrapped around her neck in the unmistakable shape of someone's hands. Someone had tried to choke the life out of her. I dragged her inside, closed the door behind us, and held her as she cried, trembling so violently I thought she might pass out. She tried to speak, but nothing came out at first except soft, broken sounds. It took nearly an hour before she could form words, and when she finally did, the truth spilled out in shattered, painful pieces. Her husband, Brandon Morrison, the charming, polished, wealthy man she had married 2 years ago, had attacked her again. This time worse than ever. Worse than she thought she could survive. She told me how it started with charm, with compliments, with careful attention that made her feel special. Then the subtle criticisms began. Her clothes, her cooking, her friends, her family, especially me. Then came the rules, the monitoring, the tracking of her phone, the restrictions on money, the guilt trips, and the constant erosion of her confidence. After that came the first shove. The first bruise. The first time he told her it was her fault. And after she stopped fighting back, after she became quiet and obedient, that was when the real violence began. Tonight, dinner had been lukewarm because Brandon arrived home late without warning. That alone had been enough for him to explode. He'd screamed. He'd grabbed her. And then he'd put his hands around her throat and squeezed until she went limp. When she woke, he stood over her and said, "If you leave me, I'll make sure no one ever finds your body." Hearing that broke something inside me. Watching her fall asleep from exhaustion broke the rest. I sat alone in the dark after she drifted off, staring at the bruises he'd left on her. My blood felt like fire. Calling the police wouldn't save her. Brandon had money, influence, lawyers, a family name that opened doors others couldn't even knock on. Claire had nothing but bruises and fear. And that wasn't enough to stop him. If she went back and he would force her back, he would kill her eventually. Quietly. Efficiently. And no one would question it. But Claire and I shared the same face. The same voice. The same build. We had fooled teachers, friends, and even boyfriends as kids. And as I looked at her sleeping on my couch, an idea formed, dangerous, insane, and the only thing that could save her. I would take her place. Only long enough to get what we needed. to gather evidence, to force the system to see him for what he really was. Claire begged me not to. She said he would notice. He always noticed everything. But I told her she'd teach me. Every mannerism, every rule, every detail of her life under him. For 48 hours she taught me how to shrink myself the way he had trained her to. How to walk quietly, speak softly, cook exactly the way he demanded, keep the house staged like a showroom, and never ever question anything. She showed me how she held her hands, how she lowered her eyes, how she breathed around him like even inhaling too loudly might anger him. By the time she finished teaching me, I hated the version of my sister he had sculpted. He had carved away her brightness, leaving a ghost of the woman she used to be. We cut my hair to match hers. She handed me her wedding ring. I slipped it onto my finger, feeling like I was shackling myself to the monster who destroyed her. Then I drove her to our aunt's house 2 hours away, somewhere Brandon never bothered to check, and returned alone to Claire's life. Walking into the Morrison home felt like stepping into a prison made of glass and silence. The house was spotless, cold, dead. Brandon appeared from his office the moment I stepped in, his eyes scanning me with suspicion, like a predator assessing prey. I mimicked Claire perfectly, soft voice, lowered gaze, timid posture, and he accepted it, though uneasily. Dinner was tense. He criticized everything. He studied every blink, every breath. He stared at me long enough that my skin crawled, but I stayed in character. That first night he grabbed my wrist when I entered the bedroom, squeezing so hard my fingers went numb. He asked who I had texted earlier. He asked why I walked differently, why I breathed differently, why I seemed tense. I kept my answers trembling and quiet. He stared at me like he was trying to peer inside my skull. And then he said something I'll never forget. "You think I don't notice every lie on your face?" Days passed like that. Every hour was a test. Every movement could have exposed me. But I learned him too. I learned where he kept the documents tracking Claire's movements. I learned where he stored screenshots, notes, receipts, and financial records showing how thoroughly he had taken control of her life. I found his plans for a smear campaign he intended to use if she ever tried to leave. I recorded everything with hidden devices. But the advocate helping us told me it still wasn't enough. We needed his confession. I didn't have to wait long. On the 7th night, he came home drunk and volatile. He ranted about the house being messy even though it wasn't. Then my phone buzzed, Claire checking in. He snatched it, saw the message, and shattered the device against the wall. He accused me of lying. He slapped me with such force that my vision flashed white. But when I turned back toward him, I let go of Claire's timid mask. I looked at him with my own eyes, cold, furious, unbroken. That was the moment he realized something was wrong. And the moment I said, "Wrong twin." His face twisted in confusion, then rage. He lunged at me, but I was ready. I blocked him, flipped him onto the floor, pinned him with my knee, and pulled out my backup phone. I demanded answers. And he gave them, screaming, ranting, confessing to everything he'd done to Claire. Every threat, every violent act, every moment of control. All recorded, all undeniable. Then the front door burst open as the police, the advocate, and backup entered. Brandon was dragged away, thrashing and screaming that he'd get out, that we'd pay, that nothing was over. But the door slammed shut behind him, and the house finally fell silent. For the first time in a long time, Claire was safe. But I wasn't finished. Because men like Brandon don't stop. Not even from behind bars. And I wasn't going to wait for him to hurt her again. Brandon's arrest should have felt like the end of a nightmare, but instead it felt like the quiet breath before a storm. The kind you sense in your bones. The kind that warns you something worse is coming. Legally, he was trapped. We had his confession. We had evidence. We had advocates, officers, and investigators all confirming Claire's story. But Brandon Morrison wasn't the kind of man who feared handcuffs. Power was his currency, and men like him always believed they could buy their way out. And deep down, I knew that if he ever walked free again, even for a day, my sister wouldn't survive the second chance he'd take. So while Claire stayed hidden with our aunt, recovering slowly, I prepared for the inevitable retaliation. The first sign came 2 days after his arrest. I woke up in Claire's house, still pretending to be her until we could safely move, and found the living room window cracked open. Not shattered. Not forced. Just open. Too precise to be an accident. Brandon's family had keys to the house. Maybe his friends too. I closed the window quietly and locked it, but the cold air lingering in the room left goosebumps crawling up my arms. Then came the phone calls. Unknown numbers. Always silent when I answered. I didn't let the fear show. I stayed calm, methodical, focused because fear gives people like Brandon leverage. And I had no intention of giving him anything. The police believed he would stay behind bars until trial. I believed they were underestimating his arrogance. And I was right. For days later he made bail, paid by his influential father, despite multiple officers arguing against it. The moment I heard the news, something inside me went still. Not scared. Not panicked. Just focused. This was the moment I had been preparing for. And I was no longer interested in waiting for the court system to decide whether my sister lived or died. Brandon came home that same night. The moment I heard the front door open, I slipped into the kitchen, kept the lights off, and gripped the edge of the counter with both hands to steady myself. His footsteps were loud, heavy, furious. He wasn't pretending anymore. The mask he used to hide behind was gone. What walked into that house was something raw and dangerous. "Claire," he called out, his voice low, controlled, and dripping with venom. "Come downstairs. I'm not asking again." I stepped into the doorway, letting the dim hallway light catch my face just enough for him to see the outline of Claire. He stared at me with eyes full of fire and something else, betrayal. It wasn't betrayal that she'd been hurt. It was betrayal that she'd defied him. "You think you're clever," he said, walking toward me with slow, deliberate steps. "You think you can humiliate me. You think you can ruin me." I didn't answer. Claire would have apologized, would have begged. But I wasn't Claire. And this time he saw it instantly. He narrowed his eyes. "That look again," he muttered. "That look you gave me the night of the recording." He stepped closer. Too close. "You're not her." I didn't move. I didn't flinch. Instead, I made him look me dead in the eyes as I said softly, "I'm the one who's going to destroy you." His expression twisted into something dark and twisted. In that moment, he didn't just want control anymore. He wanted revenge. He lunged at me, but this time I had a plan. I dodged, grabbed a heavy crystal vase from the table, and swung it at him. It shattered across his shoulder, not enough to knock him out but enough to stun him. He grabbed my arm and slammed me against the wall, his fingers tightening around my throat. Not enough to choke, but enough to show me how easily he could. "You think you can fight me?" he growled. "You're nothing. I built this life. I built Claire. I can break you the same way." But this time I didn't shrink. I didn't whimper. Instead, I stared at him with unblinking fury until something inside him flickered in confusion. I spit blood on his shirt and whispered, "Try." The rage exploded in him and he pulled his fist back. Before he could strike, the police burst through the door, guns drawn, shouting commands. They tackled him, forcing him to the ground. He screamed my name, Claire's name, vowing he'd find us both. That he'd finish what he started. That we'd never be free of him. They dragged him out as he thrashed and roared like a caged animal. And the last thing I saw before the door slammed shut was the pure hatred in his eyes. But even after he was gone, the house didn't feel safe. His presence lingered in the walls, in the silence, in the memory of his hands around my throat. I left that night, locking the door behind me and walking away from the place where Claire had suffered for far too long. The next few weeks turned into a dangerous waiting game. Brandon was denied bail for a second time, but that didn't stop his influence from spreading. Rumors started. Lies circulated online. Anonymous threats came to my phone and email. Claire's reputation was attacked from every angle. People calling her unstable, manipulative, unfaithful. Brandon was trying to annihilate her character to save his own. But every smear campaign he launched, I countered. Every lie he spread, I documented. Every threat he sent, I handed straight to the police. Still, something told me this wasn't the final battle. And I was right. 3 weeks before his trial, Brandon escaped from the transport van, taking him from jail to court for a hearing. The moment the news alert buzzed across my phone, the world narrowed into a single terrifying truth. He was coming. Not for revenge. Not for justice. For closure. To erase the only 2 people who could expose him. The police tried to reach me, but I was already moving. I drove straight to my aunt's house, where Claire had been hiding and slowly regaining her strength. When I arrived, she was sitting at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. She looked calmer, more present, more alive than she had the night she came to my door. But when I told her Brandon had escaped, the color drained from her face. "He won't stop," she whispered. "Not until one of us is dead." I knelt in front of her and took her hands. "Then we make sure it isn't you." She shook her head. "Amber, you can't keep risking your life for me." I smiled sadly, softly, honestly. "I'm not risking it. I'm choosing it." Before she could protest, headlights appeared in the driveway. A single car. Engine running. Idle. Waiting. My stomach dropped as I stood up slowly and moved to the window. Brandon Morrison was here. And this time he didn't want evidence. He wanted blood. The headlights outside didn't move. They stayed fixed on the house, unmoving and deliberate. The low hum of an idling engine filled the night air, steady and unsettling, like a warning pulse. Inside, Claire stood behind me trembling, and my aunt carefully locked every door she could reach. But deep down I knew none of the locks mattered. They were a comfort for ordinary dangers. Brandon was not ordinary. I stepped away from the window and whispered to Claire, "Go to the basement. Stay there until I tell you it's safe." She shook her head immediately, panic in her eyes. "Amber, he doesn't want you. He wants me." I held her shoulders gently. "He doesn't get either of us. Not anymore. Please, go." With visible hesitation, she finally nodded and followed my aunt down the stairs. She looked back one last time, fear written all over her, before she disappeared into the dark. Then I went outside. The cold air felt sharp against my skin, the kind of chill that suggested something was coming. Brandon climbed out of his car calmly, almost casually, like he was greeting me for a friendly conversation. That calmness was more dangerous than shouting ever could be. "So it was you," he said, stepping closer, pretending to be Claire. "I underestimated how far you'd go." There was no surprise in his tone, only anger tightly wrapped in a controlled voice. "You cost me my job, my reputation, everything. You think this ends with court papers?" I kept my voice steady. "It ends with you stopping, Brandon. Tonight." He laughed softly, stepping closer. "Nothing ends until I decide it ends." Without another word, he lunged. He tackled me to the ground, but I rolled out from under him before he could fully pin me. My training kicked in, not to harm him but to get away, to protect myself. I scrambled toward the tool shed, not to arm myself with anything dangerous, but to put a barrier between us, to get space. He followed, stumbling slightly in his anger. Inside the shed, I grabbed the nearest harmless object with some weight. A metal bar used for lifting heavy garden pots. Not a weapon meant to injure, but something that could block or deflect if he tried to grab me again. He stepped into the shed, eyes narrowed. "You think you can fight me?" he said, moving closer. "You've made this much worse for yourself." I didn't respond. I focused on his movements. When he tried to grab me again, I used the bar to block his arm and pushed him back enough to step away safely. It wasn't a strike, just creating space, using technique rather than force. He grew more frustrated, less controlled. That loss of control became his downfall. I grabbed a small canister of harmless paint thinner from a shelf and threw it at his chest. It wasn't enough to hurt him, but it startled him, made him wipe his shirt, distracted him long enough for me to slip past him out the shed door. He chased me, but by then, the sirens were already echoing down the long country road. My aunt had called the police the moment he stepped out of his car. I turned toward the flashing lights approaching. Brandon spun toward them too, breathing hard, anger radiating off him. Officers pulled into the driveway and jumped out, issuing clear commands. Brandon raised his voice, claiming I attacked him, insisting he had every right to be there. But the officers didn't move in his favor. They'd seen the previous reports. They'd seen the restraining order violation. They'd had warnings filed by the domestic violence advocate. They listened to my aunt's frantic call. They saw Brandon advancing on me despite police presence. They acted. They placed him in handcuffs while he protested loudly, insisting none of this was real, insisting Claire belonged to him, insisting he would fix all of this. The officers stayed calm, collected, unshaken. They read him his rights and escorted him to the car. For the first time since I'd met him, I saw something in Brandon's eyes that had never been there before. Fear. Not fear of me. Not fear of consequences. Fear of losing complete control over everything he believed he owned. As the police car pulled away into the night, the sirens fading, I felt the air leave my lungs. Not relief, not yet, but the first real step toward it. But even as the silence returned, I knew the story wasn't finished until the courtroom finished what we started. Until the world saw the truth behind his polite smiles and practiced charm. And I was going to make sure the world saw every piece of it. The night Brandon was arrested, Claire didn't come out of the basement until the police car disappeared completely from the road. When she finally emerged, her steps were unsteady but determined. She looked at me like she was afraid I'd vanish if she blinked too long. My aunt wrapped her in a blanket and held her close, whispering that she was safe, that it was over. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Trauma doesn't vanish with a pair of handcuffs. Fear doesn't dissolve under red and blue lights. Control doesn't disappear the moment the abuser is removed. Claire flinched when a car door shut down the street. She jumped when my phone buzzed. She apologized repeatedly for things she didn't need to apologize for. The blanket, the tea, the lights, her breathing. Every day revealed another small habit she had learned in that house. Another instinct shaped by survival. I stayed with her. Day and night. We slept in the same room for the first week like we used to when we were little. I kept the lamp on because darkness made her tense. My aunt cooked her meals and Claire kept asking if the portions were right, as if someone might punish her for getting them wrong. When my aunt reassured her, Claire cried, quietly, deeply, silently, because she had forgotten what choices felt like. I watched her slowly relearn freedom. Meanwhile, Brandon's legal storm began. The district attorney's office reviewed the recordings I'd gathered. The verbal lashings, the threats, the obsessive control. They reviewed the medical documentation from the night Claire arrived at my apartment. They reviewed the pattern. Isolation, monitoring, domination. His lawyers tried everything. They claimed the recordings were taken out of context. They claimed Claire had exaggerated for sympathy. They claimed I had impersonated her with malicious intent. They claimed the police acted too aggressively. But the evidence stacked higher than their excuses. Then something unexpected happened. People started talking. Neighbors who used to exchange friendly waves with Brandon came forward with incidents they brushed off. Nights they heard shouting through the walls. Times they saw Claire with sunglasses in cloudy weather. Moments when Brandon's temper leaked through his polished exterior. Former colleagues described his competitiveness, his need to dominate, how he reacted when challenged. The picture painted itself. Still, Brandon didn't give up. Control was his identity, and surrender was a language he didn't speak. When he was denied bail, Claire finally breathed for the first time since her wedding day. But the system moves slowly, and a restraining order doesn't stop someone from using proxies. A month later, we started noticing things. Someone leaving anonymous notes on our mailbox. Blank paper folded once, as if meant only to unsettle. Someone calling the landline and hanging up the second my aunt answered. Someone driving past the house a little too slowly. None of it proved anything, but all of it felt familiar. Claire's anxiety grew again. She stayed near windows less. She double-checked locks. She whispered instead of speaking in normal volume. Then one morning while I was making coffee, Claire walked into the kitchen with a pale face and a trembling hand holding her phone. "Amber, look." Her voicemail held a message. Not Brandon's voice, but a male voice she didn't recognize. Calm, flat, almost polite. "You should stop talking to the DA. People see everything. People remember things. Just a friendly warning." My stomach dropped. Brandon didn't need to give orders directly. There were always people willing to act on behalf of powerful men who promise favors. I called the detective immediately. He asked us to come in and postpone Claire's next interview for safety precautions. He also put a patrol car on the street outside my aunt's home. Claire slept slightly better that night because of it. Still, I couldn't ignore the unease that followed us like a shadow. Brandon might have been behind bars, but fear remained his most loyal accomplice. Weeks passed. The court date approached. Claire agreed to testify, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. She wasn't afraid of speaking the truth. She was afraid of being in the same room as him, even with guards present, even behind a table. "I can't look at him," she whispered during one of her sleepless nights. "If I look at him, I'll freeze. I'll forget everything. I'll fall apart again." "You won't," I said gently. "But you don't have to do this alone." And I meant it. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. The air felt heavy with quiet speculation. Brandon sat with his attorneys freshly groomed, wearing a crisp suit and a practiced expression of calm innocence. He glanced our way once, just once, and the coldness in his eyes brought back every moment I had lived in his house pretending to be Claire. The prosecution laid out the evidence with precision. The defense countered with polished arguments and deflection. But the recordings, the documented pattern, the medical findings were hard to spin. Then Claire took the stand. She trembled as she walked, her hands shaking even as she gripped the railing. But when she began speaking, something in her voice shifted. Fear didn't vanish, but determination rose with it. She told the truth. Steady, clear, painful. Her voice cracked once, but she didn't stop. She didn't back down. She didn't flinch when Brandon looked at her. The courtroom was silent. The judge, a woman with sharp eyes and an expression carved from empathy and authority, watched Claire with visible focus. The jurors took notes. Even some people on the defense side seemed uncomfortable. When I took the stand after her, I recounted the infiltration, the recordings, the night Brandon arrived at my aunt's house, the pattern we had uncovered, the possessions in his home that showed surveillance and control. I kept my voice calm, matter of fact, unwavering. I wasn't just telling a story. I was defending Claire's future. The turning point came unexpectedly. An officer testified about the night they arrested Brandon, including the things he said in custody, the threats he muttered, the refusal to acknowledge the restraining order, the implication that he still saw Claire as something he was entitled to manage. The defense objected, but the judge allowed the testimony. Brandon's mask cracked for the first time. He shook his head, whispered angrily to his attorney, tapped his fingers in that impatient, controlling rhythm Claire had described countless times. By the time closing arguments arrived, the courtroom felt tense, heavy, expectant. When the verdict came, Claire held my hand with a grip that spoke of fear and hope at war. The jury found Brandon guilty. All major charges. No ambiguity. No rescue from his lawyers. No more control. Claire cried. Not loudly, quietly, deeply, almost silently, as if afraid someone might punish her for reacting. I pulled her into a hug and felt her shoulders shake with relief that had been held inside too long. But even with the verdict, the aftermath wasn't simple. Brandon's sentence was substantial, long enough to protect Claire for years. But trauma does not obey court orders, and healing does not start automatically. Claire still struggled with sudden noises, unexpected touches, raised voices. She apologized reflexively. She asked permission out of habit. She cried when sunlight hit her skin in the morning because she felt like she was finally waking up. I stayed by her side every day. We would rebuild slowly, deliberately, patiently. Brandon could no longer control her life, but she had to learn how to live again. And I would make sure she never went through another dark moment alone. Healing came slowly, the way winter melts into spring. Not in one moment, but in a series of quiet, almost invisible changes. Claire still woke up some mornings with fear tightening her chest, but now she reached for my hand instead of shrinking into silence. She still hesitated before making decisions, but now she forced herself to try. She still apologized too often, but each week the apologies grew fewer, softer, less automatic. One morning, months after the trial ended, she walked into the kitchen without flinching at the sound of my aunt chopping vegetables. It was the smallest thing, barely noticeable unless you knew the distance she had traveled to get there. That day she smiled. A real smile. Not a forced one. Not a polite one. Not a smile shaped by fear or by the desire to please. A smile that belonged to the sister I remembered. I knew she had a long road ahead, but that smile told me she had started walking it. Still, I carried the weight of everything that had happened. I had seen the depths of what someone like Brandon could do. The quiet dominance, the calculated isolation, the way he turned affection into obedience and mistakes into punishment. I had watched him twist the world around Claire until she doubted her own reflection. And though he was now behind bars, I couldn't shake the knowledge that some people like him walked free, charming, unchallenged, unrecognized. But Claire's story wasn't going to fade into silence. She wanted her voice back. One afternoon, she sat on the back porch, staring at the trees swaying gently in the wind. I joined her quietly. For several minutes we just watched the branches, listening to the soft rustle of leaves. Then Claire spoke without looking at me. "I want to help people," she said. Her voice was steady. "People who are where I was." I turned to her, surprised and proud. "You could. Your story could help a lot of people." She nodded, her fingers tracing the wood grain of the railing. "I don't want what happened to me to just be pain. I want it to become something else. Something useful." That was when she decided to speak publicly. Not to relive the trauma, but to reclaim the space where it used to control her. She talked to victim advocates. She joined a support group. She learned how to share her story safely, without reopening wounds too raw to handle. And when she finally felt ready, she recorded her first anonymous statement for a domestic violence awareness project. Her voice was steady. Her story was powerful. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of being heard. Meanwhile, I took my own steps forward. I made peace with the role I had played, the risks I had taken, the decisions I had made, the moments where fear nearly broke me. I learned that revenge doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes revenge is survival. Sometimes it is reclaiming life from someone who tried to take it. And sometimes the most powerful revenge is showing the world exactly who the villain was, and refusing to let them write the ending. One evening, months after the trial, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a press release from the State Corrections Department. Brandon Morrison had been denied his first review hearing due to behavioral concerns. He would remain in the high-security facility for the foreseeable future. I read the announcement twice, then handed the phone to Claire. She exhaled slowly, not with fear, not with panic, but with relief. The shadow that had lingered over her since the day she married him began to fade somewhere deep inside. "He can't hurt anyone anymore," she whispered. "No," I said gently. "He can't." We stood on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in muted gold and soft orange. Claire reached for my hand, and for the first time in a long time, her grip wasn't desperate or trembling. It was steady. She had survived. She had fought. She had reclaimed her life. And no matter how dark the past had been, no matter how deep the scars ran, she was rising stronger, wiser, unbroken. Brandon had taken years from her, but he didn't get to keep them. She was building new ones, brighter ones, brick by brick. And I would be there for every step of that rebuilding. Because sisterhood is not just shared blood. It is shared survival, shared resilience, shared rebirth after the storm. Claire was no longer a victim, not a captive, not a shadow of herself. She was free, finally truly free. And this time no one would ever take that from her again.